You stopped needing people to get it. Not because you gave up, not because you stopped caring, but because somewhere along the way, you realized that the explanation was costing you more than the misunderstanding ever did. That is not indifference. That is something much more specific than that. Most men spend years trying to be understood. They explain, they clarify, they rephrase. They soften the edges of who they are so the room feels less uncomfortable. And for a long time, you did that too. You adjusted your tone, you added disclaimers. You made yourself easier to read. And it never worked. Not really, because the people who were going to understand you understood you, and the ones who were not did not. No amount of explaining changed that. So at some point, you stopped. Not with bitterness, not with a declaration, you just quietly stopped performing the translation. And the first thing you noticed was how much quieter everything got. You do not leave rooms in anger. You leave them because you stopped needing to be there. You do not end conversations with a point to prove. You end them because continuing past a certain threshold costs something you are not willing to spend. People around you sometimes read that as coldness, as distance, as arrogance even. And you have noticed that too. You have watched someone decide who you are and realized you have no interest in correcting them. Not because you do not care what people think. You are not that indifferent. But because the version they have decided on is not worth the energy it would take to dismantle it. That is not detachment. That is a specific kind of psychological economy that most people never develop. You have learned to measure the return on emotional investment. And most of the time, defending your image to someone who has already made up their mind pays nothing. There is something about the way you move through your days that other people sometimes find hard to read. You are not performative about it. You do not announce your depth. You do not signal how much is going on beneath the surface because you stopped needing the acknowledgement that something is. You know what you carry. That is enough. Most men your age are still looking for permission. Permission to be private. Permission to be selective. Permission to stop explaining their choices to people who will not understand them anyway. You stopped asking for permission a while ago, not with drama, just with a gradual, quiet withdrawal from conversations that were never going to end anywhere useful. You have relationships, meaningful ones, people you trust completely and who understand you without requiring translation. And those relationships are not the problem. Those relationships are the evidence. The evidence that you are not hiding. You're just no longer performing. Here's what the psychology actually looks like underneath this. At some point in a man's development, there is a shift that happens in where he sources his internal sense of legitimacy. Early on, that legitimacy comes from the outside, from approval, from being read correctly, from feeling like the people around him have an accurate picture of who he is. But something changes, sometimes gradually, sometimes after a specific set of experiences. The man begins to locate that legitimacy internally. He stops needing the outside world to confirm what he already knows about himself. Psychologists sometimes call this internal locus of control. But that clinical framing misses the texture of what it actually feels like. It does not feel like a theory. It feels like exhaustion that became clarity. You got tired of the performance. And in getting tired of it, you discovered that you did not need it. The misunderstanding became less threatening because the understanding it would have replaced stopped being essential. And here is what that actually changes in practice. When someone misreads your silence as anger, you do not rush to correct it. When someone assumes your directness is hostility, you do not soften it. When someone decides you are closed off because you do not open up to everyone, you do not argue the point. Not because they are right, but because the correction would require you to care more about their picture of you than you care about your own peace. And you learned that is not a trade you are willing to make. There is something specific about men in their 40s and 50s that makes this easier to arrive at. You have enough lived experience to have seen the pattern play out. You have explained yourself to people who still misread you. You have been generous with your story and watched it change nothing about how someone already decided to see you. You have also been around long enough to know the difference between the people who earn your openness and the people who have never given you a reason to offer it. That discernment is not damage. That is intelligence accumulated over time. The men who never develop this tend to spend their whole lives adjusting, editing, modifying. They become expert translators of their own inner world, constantly rendering themselves into a language they hope the room will accept. And the exhaustion of that is enormous. Even when they do not name it as exhaustion, you named it. That is why you stopped. The real mechanism underneath the willingness to be misunderstood is this. Most people use the way others see them as a mirror. They look at the reflection to figure out who they are. They need the external image to confirm the internal one. You stopped using that mirror. Or more accurately, you stopped trusting it. Not because other people are wrong about everything, but because you learned that the reflection they give you is filtered through their own needs, their own fears, their own stories. The image they send back is rarely a clean picture of you. It is a picture of you as they need you to be. And once you understand that, being misunderstood stops being a threat, because the person doing the misunderstanding is not actually seeing you in the first place. They are seeing a version of you that serves something in them. Correcting that image does not make it more accurate. It just makes it differently inaccurate. So you let it stand. There are men who have tried to tell you this is a wall, that you have built something protective around yourself that keeps people out. And you have sat with that long enough to know whether it is true. It is not a wall. A wall is built from fear. What you have is more like a threshold. Some people cross it. Many do not. The ones who cross it are the ones who have shown you that your openness will not be used carelessly. That is not armor. That is just good judgment. You also know this about yourself. You are harder to know than most people expect. Not because you hide, but because you do not advertise. You do not put what you are on the surface for easy access. The things that matter to you are not up for casual handling. And most people, when they cannot access the surface version of you quickly, decide the depth is not there. You have made peace with that. The men who eventually see what is actually there, see it because they stayed. Because they were patient enough to wait for something real instead of expecting a performance up front. The ones who did not stay decided based on the absence of something they were looking for. That is not a loss you grieve. What you have built in the years of being misunderstood is something you could not have built any other way. You built a picture of yourself that is not dependent on being seen correctly. You built an identity that does not require consensus. You know who you are through your own consistent behavior over time, through the decisions you made when no one was watching, through the values you kept even when keeping them cost you something. That is a much more durable foundation than approval. Most people's sense of who they are is built on external evidence. It needs to be constantly maintained and updated by what others reflect back. When the reflection is unfavorable, the foundation shakes. Yours does not shake that way anymore. Not because you are beyond caring, you care. But what you care about has become much more specific. You care about the few people who actually know you. You care about whether your behavior is consistent with who you say you are. You care about doing the work in front of you well, not about whether someone outside of it recognizes that you did. That shift is quiet. It happens without fanfare. Most men who arrive at it could not tell you exactly when it happened, but they know it happened because of what is no longer there. The low-grade anxiety of how you are being read. The impulse to explain a decision to someone who did not ask. The discomfort of sitting in a room where someone has the wrong impression of you and feeling nothing about it that needs to be acted on. Those things went quiet. And what came in to replace them was not indifference. It was something more settled, a kind of internal stability that does not depend on what the room decides about you. You are okay with being misunderstood because you finally understand yourself clearly enough that the misreading feels irrelevant. Not small, not harmless, just irrelevant. The people who know you know you. The ones who do not have a version they have assembled from what they could access. And that version says more about their capacity to see than it does about who you actually are. You have stopped apologizing for being someone who takes time to know. That is not a flaw. That is a filter. There is one more thing worth naming. The men who are most disturbed by your willingness to let misunderstandings stand are usually the ones who cannot imagine doing it themselves, because their sense of who they are depends on managing perceptions. Every misread is an emergency for them. Every unfavorable impression is a problem to be solved. They are always in the middle of some repair, some adjustment, some explanation to someone who got the wrong idea. And watching you not do that unsettles them. It looks like you do not care, but they can see enough of you to know you do. So they call it pride, or they call it coldness, or they decide there is something wrong with a man who can sit with being misunderstood without flinching. What they are actually seeing is the thing they have not built in themselves yet: the ability to hold your own story without needing everyone in the room to co-sign it. That is the part that takes years. Not because it is complicated, but because everything around you is constantly pushing in the other direction. Every social system rewards the performance, rewards the legibility, rewards the man who makes himself easy to read and easy to approve of. You stopped optimizing for that, and in stopping, you became something harder to categorize, harder to dismiss, harder to fully get a hold of. Which means the people who find their way to a real understanding of you are doing something harder than just reading a surface. They are paying attention over time. They are sitting with what you show them and not demanding more before it is offered. Those are the people who are still here. That has always been the point. You're not trying to be unknowable. You're not performing mystery. You are just living at a depth that requires something from the people who want to know you. And you stopped apologizing for that requirement a long time ago because the alternative was spending the rest of your life in the shallows, legible, convenient, thoroughly understood by everyone, and genuinely known by no one. That was the trade you refused. And that refusal is what this actually is. Not isolation, not damage, not a symptom of something that needs correcting. Just a man who decided that being fully seen by a few is worth more than being partially seen by everyone. You already know that is true. You have always known.